Hello, I am glad you are here, settling in for a calm and gentle journey into the past. Let us take our time, let the world grow quiet around us, and ease slowly into a long and reflective story that stretches across centuries. This will be a history told not in haste, but in the soft rhythm of an evening breeze moving through old wooden eaves. Let us begin. In the long peace of the Edo period, when Japan had been largely unified and the great wars of the Sengoku age had finally receded into memory, a curious detail often caught the eye of those who observed samurai in their daily routines. At their waists or tucked neatly into their sleeves, there rested a small blade, sometimes no longer than a handspan, wrapped carefully in silk. These tiny weapons, so modest in size compared to the sweeping curvature of the katana, seemed almost symbolic. They were not displayed to intimidate, nor were they drawn with dramatic flourish at the slightest provocation. Instead, they seemed to rest like quiet reminders of something older than the peaceful age in which the samurai lived, something that reached back into the mist of centuries, when warfare was not ceremonial but immediate, personal, and unpredictable. To understand why the samurai carried such blades wrapped in silk during peaceful times, one must first step backward into earlier centuries. In the Heian period, when courtly beauty flourished in poetry and ritual, the warrior class had not yet risen to its later authority. But even then, the seeds of their martial identity were forming. Warriors traveled long distances to protect aristocratic estates, confronting bandits, rival clans, and the unpredictable violence of an unsettled countryside. During such journeys, a small, easily accessible blade was practical, for not all dangers allowed the long motion of drawing a larger sword. A swift slash, a hidden defense, or even a tool for everyday tasks could make the difference between safety and injury. Over time, practicality hardened into custom, and custom into tradition. As generations passed, the small blade took on new meanings. Silk, smooth and resilient, was wrapped around the handle not for decoration alone, but to protect the blade and the hands that held it. Silk absorbed sweat, resisted moisture, and provided a clean grip even in the rain. The wrapping process itself became a quiet act of discipline. A samurai who wrapped his small blade each morning or evening was reminded of his role, his lineage, his obligations, and the ever-present possibility of danger in even the most tranquil moments. With each fold of silk, a warrior reaffirmed the idea that peace was a gift that required vigilance, not a state that could be taken for granted. By the time Japan entered the Edo period under the Tokugawa shogunate, wars had ceased, and the samurai found themselves living in a society that asked them to be administrators, scholars, and moral exemplars rather than battlefield commanders. Their armor became ceremonial, their swords became symbols of class rather than frequently used weapons, and their martial duties shifted into the disciplined movements of training halls rather than real combat. Yet still, the small blade remained. It was discreet, unobtrusive, and devoid of the drama that accompanied carrying a full pair of long and short swords into a peaceful town. The small blade felt appropriate for a time when violence was no longer the rhythm of daily life. Some historians believe that such blades served as tools more often than as weapons. A samurai might use it to cut loose threads, to prepare seals, to shape bamboo, or to perform small repairs while traveling. The wrapping of silk prevented damage from constant handling and kept the blade from clattering or snagging on clothing. In a culture that valued quiet composure, even the sound of metal brushing against wooden scabbards might be seen as inelegant. A silk-wrapped small blade moved silently, fitting seamlessly into the cultivated calm of Edo-era manners. But there was also a deeper cultural layer to its presence. The samurai, despite living in a peaceful age, were bound by the ideal of being ever ready. The small blade symbolized readiness without aggression, alertness without paranoia. It allowed a warrior to maintain a sense of identity even as the world around him transformed. When a samurai walked through the gates of his lord's castle, he might be required to leave his longer swords at the entrance as a sign of respect and trust. Yet the small blade often remained close at hand. It was not considered a breach of protocol, for it did not carry the same connotations as a full sword. Instead, it represented personal responsibility, a final line of defense, or even an instrument of duty in the rare but solemn context of ritual acts that samurai were trained to perform. The silk itself held symbolic meaning as well. Silk had long been a material associated with refinement, discipline, and care. Wrapping an object in silk implied respect for it. Thus, the silk-wrapped small blade became a fusion of practicality and symbolism, a quiet expression of a warrior's disciplined mindset. It was not enough for the blade simply to be carried. It had to be kept, maintained, and handled with intention. The silk protected the blade, and the blade protected the samurai's connection to his own past. For many samurai, especially those whose duties had shifted into administrative or bureaucratic roles, the small blade was a psychological anchor. It reminded them of the ideals they were taught, the stories of their ancestors, and the moral codes they were expected to embody. Even if a samurai never once had to draw it in defense, carrying it assured him that he retained the essence of his role. In this way, the small blade bridged the changing eras, binding together memories of conflict with the reality of peace. As the peaceful decades stretched into generations, fathers passed down these small blades to their sons, not as weapons of war but as symbols of continuity. The silk wrappings were often replaced, renewed, or decorated according to family traditions. Some families used pale colors, others deep hues, and still others embroidered subtle patterns into the fabric, ensuring that the humble blade became a quiet heirloom. In this way, the small blade also became a carrier of family history, a modest vessel containing the weight of lineage. Travelers in Edo period Japan sometimes wrote of seeing samurai pause on quiet evenings to unwrap their small blades, inspect them against the soft glow of lamplight, clean them with deliberate care, and wrap them again. These nightly rituals were not dramatic gestures meant for an audience. They were private acts, carried out with the same calm concentration that a monk might bring to copying a sutra. The maintenance of the blade, the soft stroke of the silk binding, the mindful breath accompanying each motion, these became a meditation on discipline and identity. And so the presence of the small blade persisted, even as Japan moved closer to the upheavals of the 19th century. When foreign ships arrived, when reforms began to reshape society, and when the samurai class faced unprecedented changes, these tiny blades remained a part of their daily dress. They were the last whisper of an era that had understood the weight of tradition and the importance of being prepared for the unexpected. As the 19th century drew nearer, the presence of the small silk-wrapped blade gained new subtleties in meaning. Japan, long closed to the outside world, felt the tremors of change well before the first black-hulled ships arrived in Edo Bay. Rumors flowed through castle towns, and along the Takeda Road that shifts in power, foreign influence, and internal unrest might disturb the peace the Tokugawa shogunate had maintained for centuries. For samurai who had spent their lives in relative quiet, these rumors stirred a complex blend of anticipation and apprehension. The small blade at their side, inconspicuous yet familiar, seemed to change from a symbol of peaceful readiness to a reminder that tranquility could not last forever. In the countryside, where castle towns rose like islands amid expansive fields, samurai households kept their routines with disciplined consistency. A retainer might spend his morning copying documents, reviewing political correspondence, or supervising the storage of rice taxes. Yet even in these tasks, the blade remained nearby. It rested beside writing brushes. It lay on a low table near the tatami mat where a samurai removed his sandals before entering his lord's audience chamber. It was tucked into a sash on the hip when he walked the perimeter of the domain to check that guards were performing their duties. The blade's small presence communicated something that needed no voice. It was a statement of personal duty, a subtle vow that though the world appeared orderly, one must still be ready for unexpected turns. If one walked slowly through a castle town in the early morning, long before shopkeepers opened their sliding doors, the quiet of the streets held a certain gentle stillness. Lanterns hung from eaves, casting faint shapes across the ground. Footsteps echoed softly along narrow lanes as samurai made their way to training halls. There, in the dim light of dawn, instructors emphasized not only the forms of swordsmanship, but the inward qualities judged essential for a warrior: calm, restraint, clarity of mind. They reminded their students that the sword was not to be drawn lightly, that the ideal of a warrior lay not in the striking of blows, but in the cultivation of discipline. The small blade symbolized this teaching. Its modest size forced one to understand that a warrior's true strength resided not in the weapon itself, but in the mind that guided it. One could often see a student after training kneeling to wrap the small blade again, smoothing the silk with unhurried motions. The silk did not merely cover the blade, it symbolized control. A wrapped blade could not be used impulsively. It demanded a moment of pause, a moment to unwind the fabric, a moment to consider. And in that moment, a rash decision might fade. The peaceful age depended on such moments. The shogunate's stability rested on the belief that samurai, even when armed, would not act recklessly. In the estates of higher-ranking samurai, the blade took on ceremonial value as well. During formal gatherings, when robes of fine silk rustled softly as men bowed to one another, small blades were placed with care on stands or tucked discreetly under layers of clothing. In these settings, the blade was not a tool to be used. It was an emblem. It conveyed a message of status and legacy, expressing that its owner belonged to a lineage that valued integrity, loyalty, and preparedness. Guests who visited such estates sometimes remarked on the understated grace with which these objects were treated. They were not flaunted, not displayed like trophies, but maintained with quiet reverence. The painstaking care given to these small blades extended beyond their immediate purpose. Artisans who forged them, though not always as renowned as those who crafted great swords, took pride in their work. In small village workshops far from bustling cities, the clink of hammer on metal echoed through the air as smiths shaped short, sturdy blades meant to last generations. The forging of a small blade followed principles similar to those of crafting a larger sword. Steel was folded and hammered repeatedly, impurities driven out, layers fused together until the blade embodied durability and resilience. The smith sometimes etched subtle patterns into the steel, not elaborate, but enough to give each piece its own quiet identity. When the blade reached the home of a samurai, silk wrappers were chosen with thought. The color might reflect a family trait, or a personal preference, or an association with a mentor. A blade wrapped in deep indigo silk suggested steadiness. One wrapped in muted brown hinted at humility. A soft gray wrapping conveyed tranquility, like morning mist over a river. Silk was prized not only for its feel, but also for its ability to hold dye with richness and depth. Over the years, as the silk wore thin from use, a samurai might rewrap the blade, turning the maintenance into a symbolic renewal of his own inner vows. During travels, the importance of the small blade became even more apparent. The roads of Edo period Japan, though regulated and patrolled, were long and varied. Travelers moved between mountains and valleys, through forests and across rivers, encountering weather, wildlife, and occasionally bandits. While few samurai expected to engage in serious combat on these journeys, having the blade close at hand provided reassurance. It could cut wood for a fire, slice through tough rope, help repair a sandal strap, or even carve a message to leave behind in case of separation from companions. The silk wrapping kept the blade from rusting during extended exposure to humidity, an invaluable advantage in a land where rainy seasons could last for months. In roadside inns, samurai often placed their small blades within easy reach while resting. Though etiquette required that long swords be set aside at designated spots near the entrance, the small blade remained with the individual. Innkeepers grew accustomed to the sight of travelers sitting before low trays of simple food, their small silk-wrapped blades lying beside them. It became an unspoken rule that one did not question or remark upon these items. They were as much a part of the warrior's clothing as his robes or sandals. Even in times of illness or fatigue, samurai took care not to neglect these blades. A warrior confined to bed might ask a family member or attendant to inspect the blade, clean it, or rewrap it. This showed not vanity but dedication. In the samurai worldview, the blade symbolized the state of the spirit. A neglected blade implied a neglected inner discipline. Caring for it was a way of affirming life even when one's body was weak. As children born into samurai families grew old enough to understand their heritage, parents introduced them to the significance of the small blade long before allowing them to handle larger weapons. A father might kneel beside his son or daughter, lay the blade gently before them, and explain that being a warrior was not about seeking conflict, but about carrying responsibility. He might let them touch the silk wrapping, telling them that the softness of the silk reminded a warrior to temper his strength with compassion. In these lessons, the blade served not as a weapon but as a teaching tool, a physical representation of values that stretched far beyond martial skill. In many households, the most treasured small blades came not from famed swordsmiths but from ancestors. A blade passed down from great-grandfather to grandfather, from grandfather to father, and eventually to child carried more than its physical form. It held memories. It held stories of journeys taken, of duties fulfilled, of loyalties honored. When family members spoke of those who had come before them, they often gestured toward the silk-wrapped blade resting in a place of honor. The blade was a silent witness to the unfolding of the family's history. During festivals, when lanterns lined streets and crowds gathered to watch dances and processions, samurai sometimes carried their small blades concealed beneath their robes, not because danger was expected, but because tradition remained. Even as music filled the air and children laughed while chasing fireflies, the samurai's identity continued quietly beneath the surface of everyday life. The blade reminded him that joy and celebration existed alongside duty and restraint. When feudal lords traveled to Edo as part of the Senkinkadai system, the small blade once again proved indispensable. Samurai in these long processional groups covered immense distances over weeks of travel. They marched in formation, maintained strict discipline, and ensured the safety of their lord. Along the way, they encountered rainstorms, river crossings, crowded post stations, and the unrelenting fatigue of the road. In such conditions, the small blade's utility became evident. It was used for repairs, preparations, and sometimes even for medical needs during emergencies. And yet, it remained wrapped carefully in silk when not in use, its handling always deliberate and composed. Over time, foreign observers who managed to enter Japan took note of this small blade. They did not always understand its purpose, often misinterpreting it as a hidden weapon meant for assassination or secret violence. But the Japanese themselves generally did not view it this way. For most, the blade was not primarily a weapon. It was a symbol of the self. In foreign writings, one often sees surprise at how calmly and methodically Japanese warriors treated their weapons, particularly those small ones. Foreigners expected displays of bravado, but instead found quiet care and ritual. As tensions rose in the late Edo period, marked by economic strain, political divisions, and debates about opening the country, samurai across the domains felt an increasing sense of uncertainty. The small blade, long a symbol of peace, began once more to take on hints of its older role as a potential tool of protection. Samurai who patrolled streets during times of unrest kept the blade close beneath the folds of their coats. Leaders planning political reforms or resisting them alike often carried these blades during private meetings. Yet even then, silk remained wrapped around them, as though reminding those who held them that calm ought to be preserved even in turbulent times. In some instances, the small blade acquired deeper and darker connotations. Ritual practices dating back many generations had sometimes involved the use of such blades in acts of solemn commitment or personal accountability. While such acts were rare and governed by strict expectations, the small blade's presence in these rituals reinforced its symbolic weight. It represented the gravity of a samurai's oath, the depth of his loyalty, and the seriousness with which he approached duty. As Japan moved into the era of opening, foreign diplomacy, internal rebellion, and eventual restoration of imperial rule, the samurai class itself confronted dissolution. Many found themselves questioning their role in society. Others sought new paths, becoming officers in modernized armies, teachers, officials, or farmers. Yet even as their formal status faded, the memory of the small, silk-wrapped blade endured in the quiet corners of their daily lives. In the early years of the Meiji period, when swords were restricted and Western clothing began replacing traditional garments, many former samurai kept their small blades stored carefully in drawers or family chests. They no longer carried them at their sides, for the new society no longer recognized such symbols in the same way, but they could not bring themselves to discard them. The soft silk wrappings, worn from years of handling, felt like a link to ancestors whose world had vanished. Touching the blade brought a sensation of continuity in a time of upheaval. Some families, anticipating that future generations might forget the old ways, took care to write down the significance of these blades. They recorded stories explaining why their ancestors had carried them, how they had cared for them, and what meanings were associated with them. Such writings often describe the blade not as a weapon, but as a gentle reminder to live with integrity. As time passed, these accounts became valuable sources for historians seeking to understand the subtler aspects of samurai culture. Even those who had never fought in battle still viewed the small blade with deep respect. The peace of the Edo period had been long and prosperous, yet it had not erased the memory of earlier centuries when danger lurked constantly. The blade carried that memory, and so, when people looked back upon the Edo period, they saw in the small silk-wrapped blade a symbol of a warrior class that had learned to balance strength with restraint, readiness with humility. Though Japan transformed rapidly, the symbolism of the small blade found ways to survive. In certain traditional arts, references to the blade appeared subtly. In theater performances, actors portraying samurai sometimes mimed the act of adjusting a silk-wrapped blade beneath their robes. In painted screens depicting scenes of castle towns, a careful observer could see a small blade peeking from the folds of a figure's clothing. These artistic echoes preserve the quiet dignity associated with the object. Modern historians often remark that the small blade is one of the least understood artifacts of samurai life, precisely because its purpose was so varied and its symbolism so layered. It was at once a tool, a weapon, a symbol of rank, a family heirloom, a meditative object, and a reminder of mortality. It represented the duality of the samurai spirit, the capacity for decisive action, and the commitment to peaceful self-restraint. In some museums today, one can find examples of these blades displayed with their original silk wrapping still intact. The silk may be faded, the color softened by age, but the care with which it was wrapped remains evident. When one looks closely, one can imagine the hands that held it long ago, the daily rituals performed with quiet concentration, the generations that carried it through times of peace and times of uncertainty. These blades, though small, speak volumes about the society that valued them. They tell of a time when outer calm concealed inner vigilance, when identity was woven from both practical needs and deep-rooted traditions. They recall an age when warriors learned to live in harmony with peace rather than in pursuit of conflict, and when symbols of readiness became symbols of contemplation. The silk-wrapped blade endures in cultural memory because it represented the essence of the samurai better than grander objects ever could. The katana might be the most iconic image, gleaming and dramatic, but the small blade was the truer companion of daily life. It did not ask for attention. It did not provoke fear. It simply existed, quietly supporting the samurai's sense of self. And so the story of why samurai carried these small blades wrapped in silk becomes a story not merely of weaponry, but of identity, of discipline, of heritage, and of the delicate balance between peace and preparedness. As the generations passed in the early decades of the Meiji era, the presence of those small silk-wrapped blades began to drift from everyday life into the realm of memory. Many former samurai, adapting to new professions or struggling to find a place in the changing social structure, would occasionally sit in quiet evenings and lift the lid of an old wooden chest. Inside, wrapped in folded cloth and kept dry with parcels of herbs meant to ward off insects, lay these familiar remnants of their former identity. When a man held his old blade, he could feel the weight of an entire world that had once shaped his days. The blade did not gleam as brightly as before, and the silk that had once been smooth to the touch might now feel fragile, but the object still carried the spirit of discipline, readiness, and introspection. Some former samurai found it comforting to unwrap the blade very slowly, savoring the soft whisper of the silk sliding away. These motions were the same they had learned in youth: careful, deliberate, serene. Even in a modernizing Japan filled with train whistles, telegraph wires, and Western-style buildings rising in busy cities, the process of exposing the small blade transported them to earlier days when ritual and quiet dignity guided the rhythm of their lives. The contrast between these two worlds was often sharp. One moment they might be supervising a classroom of students in Western uniforms, or working as civil servants organizing new registries, and the next moment they might be alone in a room with tatami flooring, unwrapping a small blade that reminded them of the calm self-mastery they had once cultivated. The younger generation, growing up with new values and new national ambitions, sometimes viewed these blades with curiosity rather than sentiment. They were objects from a vanished age, tangible but faintly mysterious. Many young people had read stories of their samurai ancestors, but lived in a world where carrying a weapon no longer signified status or duty. Yet when grandfather or father spoke of the meaning of the silk wrapping, the young listeners often felt a gentle allure. They learned that the silk was not simply decoration, but a symbol of the idea that power ought to be tempered, that strength ought to be restrained, and that clarity of mind required regular attention. Even those who never adopted the old ways found something appealing in the philosophy that the blade represented. In some rural villages where modernization arrived slowly, a few families continued to wrap and tend their blades long after the Meiji government discouraged such habits. These families viewed their heritage with pride, believing that the small blade served not as a relic of violence, but as a reminder of honorable living. Sometimes, during gatherings around a hearth in winter, a grandfather might place the blade carefully on a low wooden table and recount stories of ancestors who had served their lords with steadfast loyalty. The children would sit in fascination, watching the lamplight reflect faintly off the polished steel. They listened to stories of sleepless nights on watch duties, of long journeys in the rain, of conflicts resolved through negotiation rather than violence. The blade, small and calm, symbolized that the greatest victories were often achieved not with force but with wisdom. As Japan continued to evolve, new cultural observers began to notice the small blades. Scholars, novelists, and artists found in them a kind of quiet poetry. They were intrigued that such an unassuming object could hold such deep significance. Painters depicted them in still life arrangements, placing them beside folded robes, ink brushes, or dried flowers, capturing the contrast between sharp steel and soft silk. Writers incorporated them into stories as symbols of memory, restraint, or personal integrity. These artistic interpretations sometimes romanticized the blade, but their fascination kept the object alive in cultural consciousness. Meanwhile, historians uncovering diaries and letters from the Edo period discovered numerous references to these blades. What most surprised them was how rarely these weapons were described in terms of combat. Instead, the writings emphasized their everyday usefulness, their role in rituals of self-discipline, and their quiet presence as companions during long periods of peace. These discoveries corrected earlier assumptions that samurai always lived on the edge of battle. The reality was that most samurai lived far from war, navigating the complexities of administration, ethics, and social conduct. The small blade served them not primarily as a tool for killing, but as a reminder to maintain readiness without surrendering to aggression. During the Taisho period, when Japan experienced a flourishing of the arts and a nostalgic interest in earlier eras, collectors began seeking out these small blades. Some were displayed in homes as aesthetic objects, admired for their simplicity. Others were kept locked away, valued more for their family history than for their artistic merit. Many individuals who had never descended from samurai families felt drawn to the blades because they symbolized an era when people had lived with a strong sense of personal duty. In a rapidly changing world filled with industrial noise and expanding cities, the quiet discipline represented by these blades felt refreshing. And yet, even as their symbolism grew, these blades remained tied to personal memory more than national identity. Unlike the katana, which eventually became a global icon representing the samurai as a whole, the small silk-wrapped blade retained an intimate, almost private character. It was the blade that lived in drawers, traveled in sleeves, and rested quietly beside a writing box. It was the blade of everyday moments and internal reflection. To those who cared about its meaning, it represented the inner life of the samurai, not the outward show. As the decades passed, descendants of former samurai continued to inherit these blades, even if they no longer used or displayed them. Sometimes they found themselves looking at the blade during moments of personal crisis or transition. When someone was uncertain about a decision or felt overwhelmed by new burdens, they might sit with the blade in hand, not to use it but simply to hold it. The sensation of the silk, softened by years of touch, reminded them that many before them had faced difficult choices with calm hearts. The steel, cool and enduring, suggested that clarity could be found by slowing down, breathing, and remembering one's roots. Meanwhile, in museums and academic works, discussions about these blades deepened. Scholars studying the Edo period explored the transformation of samurai identity during long peace. They found that the small blade symbolized the balancing point between martial origins and ethical responsibilities. In their writings, they emphasized that Edo society valued external harmony deeply, and that samurai needed a way to express their readiness without disrupting that harmony. The blade became a psychological anchor. Its small size communicated humility. Its wrapping signaled deliberate restraint. In modern times, people sometimes imagine the samurai as warriors constantly engaged in duels or battles. But the presence of the silk-wrapped blade tells a different story. It speaks of a society where the greatest battles were fought within oneself, where mastering one's impulses was considered a higher achievement than mastering an opponent. The samurai learned to cultivate patience, dignity, and calm, even when holding an object capable of causing harm. The blade was not meant to provoke fear, but to remind the warrior of his own responsibilities. In many ways, the small blade reflects a philosophy that remains relevant. Even today, individuals who study mindfulness, martial arts, or traditional crafts often reflect on the duality represented by such an object. They see in it the idea that strength must be tempered by compassion, that readiness must be balanced with gentleness, and that true discipline arises not from confrontation but from consistent self-awareness. The blade, though rooted in a distant past, embodies values that transcend time. As families preserved these blades across generations, they sometimes incorporated them into ceremonies marking transitions in life. When a young person reached adulthood, a parent might show them the family blade and explain its significance. The youth might touch the silk gently, hearing stories about ancestors who lived with integrity, patience, and responsibility. The blade served as a symbol of maturity, reminding the new adult that power in any form must be handled with care. Likewise, when an elderly relative passed away, family members often placed the small blade near items representing that person's life. It sat beside letters, photographs, and cherished keepsakes, signifying the continuity of values passed down through generations. Even individuals who had never been warriors recognized that the blade carried lessons about character. It reminded them that every action, no matter how small, contributed to the shaping of a legacy. As Japan entered the 20th century and later emerged into the modern world, the small blade came to represent not only the samurai class, but the idea that tranquility and readiness can coexist. People found comfort in this notion during times of uncertainty. The blade symbolized a kind of inner preparedness that did not depend on aggression. It reminded people that maintaining calm, especially in challenging moments, required practice, attention, and reflection. In contemporary times, when individuals visit historical sites associated with samurai culture, such as castle towns, preserved residences, or old training halls, they often learn about the symbolic importance of these small blades. Guides explain that while larger swords were often displayed prominently, the smaller blades were used more intimately. They were companions during solitude, tools for daily tasks, and reminders of personal accountability. Visitors sometimes find themselves moved by this quiet symbolism, realizing that the essence of samurai culture lay not only in martial prowess, but in the cultivation of a composed spirit. Collectors who study these blades often remark on the subtle beauty of the silk wrapping. The colors, though faded, retain a soft elegance. Some wrappings have patterns woven into them, tiny motifs that reflect seasons, virtues, or family crests. Others are plain, reflecting the simplicity favored by certain regions or individuals. The way the silk is folded around the handle reveals the preferences of the person who wrapped it. Some folds are tight and strict, others are looser and more relaxed, revealing personality and habit. Over decades of use, the silk darkened from oils of the hand and its edges frayed gently, making each blade unique through the imprint of its owner's life. These layers of meaning draw many modern viewers into contemplation. They discover that an object as small as a silk-wrapped blade can carry within it a history of discipline, compassion, practicality, and quiet reflection. This discovery often leaves a lasting impression, encouraging individuals to consider what objects in their own lives carry such significance. In a world filled with noise and distraction, the silent presence of a humble blade suggests that meaning often hides in modest places. Today, in certain traditional arts like tea ceremony, calligraphy, or classical martial arts, instructors continue to mention the philosophy behind such blades even if they are not used directly. They speak of the importance of approaching each task with the same careful attention that a samurai would use when wrapping or unwrapping his blade. They remind students that tools, whether brushes, bows, or blades, must be handled with mindfulness. These teachings preserve the spirit that once surrounded the small blade, allowing its lessons to endure even as its physical use diminishes. Even in popular culture, where samurai are often portrayed with large dramatic swords, there are occasional references to the small blade. Filmmakers who strive for historical authenticity sometimes include scenes where a warrior adjusts a tiny silk-wrapped blade beneath his clothing. Novelists who write intimate stories set in the Edo period often describe the small blade resting on a low table beside an inkstone. These subtle details allow modern audiences to glimpse the quieter side of samurai life, reminding them that behind the familiar images of armor and duels lay a world of calm rituals, silent responsibilities, and deeply internalized values. Across Japan, in old wooden homes that have been preserved for cultural heritage, small alcoves sometimes display items once used by samurai families. Among them, one might find a small blade wrapped in faded silk, placed near a lacquered writing box or a set of ancestral tablets. Visitors standing before such displays often feel a quiet stillness settle around them. The blade does not demand attention, but it invites reflection. It allows people to imagine the hands that once wrapped it each morning before duties began, or each night before the household settled into rest. Even outside Japan, in museums around the world, these blades appear in exhibitions dedicated to samurai culture. Visitors pause before them, sometimes expecting elaborate ornamentation but finding instead a humble tool wrapped in cloth. This humility surprises them. It contradicts modern stereotypes of samurai as warriors constantly ready for battle. Instead, it suggests that samurai lived lives centered on duty, self-control, and contemplation. Many viewers find this revelation soothing, as it presents a philosophy based on inner calm rather than outer force. And so the story of why samurai carried small blades wrapped in silk during peaceful times continues to resonate. It teaches that being prepared does not require aggression, that discipline can be expressed in subtle ways, and that objects can hold meanings far deeper than their physical form. The blade wrapped in silk is a reminder that history is shaped not only by dramatic events, but by quiet habits, private rituals, and thoughtfully maintained traditions. Its legacy endures because it speaks to the human desire for balance. It whispers that strength is not complete without restraint, that readiness is not complete without humility, and that peace is not complete without awareness. It reminds us that the most meaningful symbols are often the ones we carry quietly, the ones that do not shout for attention but live close to the heart. As time moved deeper into the modern era, the meaning of the small blades wrapped in silk continued to evolve, drifting further from their original purpose, yet still maintaining an inner thread that tied them to centuries of samurai life. Even as trains thundered across the countryside, and the glow of electric lamps replaced the soft flicker of oil lanterns, the quiet symbolism of these blades persisted in ways both visible and hidden. Some families stored them carefully in ornate wooden boxes, protecting them from dust and humidity, while others placed them reverently on small household altars dedicated to ancestors. Whether handled frequently or left undisturbed, these blades retained a presence that felt almost spiritual. In the decades that followed, Japan weathered periods of rapid growth, economic hardship, reconstruction, and cultural transformation. Through each era, the small silk-wrapped blade appeared now and then in personal accounts, not as a weapon but as an heirloom tied to identity. It represented a time when even in peace, one carried a reminder of vigilance, when even in calm, one respected discipline, when even in safety, one honored the memory of ancestors who had lived through harsher days. The blade was a symbol not merely of the samurai class, but of the values they aspired to embody. In some households, a child might discover the blade accidentally while exploring an attic or a storage room. The silk wrapping, faded to soft hues of gray or brown, would capture their curiosity. When they brought it to an elder, the elder often reacted with a blend of surprise and tenderness. Sitting with the child on a tatami mat, they would explain that the blade was not to be played with, not because it was dangerous in the present, but because it held the story of their family. They spoke of ancestors who carried the blade during long travels between domains, who used it to prepare writing materials or carve small tokens, who wrapped it each morning as an act of respect toward their duties. For the child, these stories often brought the distant past into vivid focus. The samurai were no longer just figures from textbooks or cinema screens. They were real people whose hands had touched this very blade. The child might imagine them walking through castle courtyards in soft leather sandals, or kneeling by lamplight to practice calligraphy, or adjusting the silk wrapping before heading out on official business. The blade, small and silent, became a doorway through which modern generations glimpsed a world shaped by ritual, patience, and quiet intention. Meanwhile, scholars studying the everyday life of the Edo period continued to uncover fascinating details about how samurai incorporated such blades into their routines. They found that many domains had specific expectations regarding how samurai should carry themselves within castle grounds, and that the small blade allowed warriors to seem humble and non-threatening while still preserving a sense of readiness. They found that during long conferences, when highest-ranking officials sat in formal positions for hours discussing matters of law, agriculture, or diplomacy, samurai would often rest their small, silk-wrapped blades beside them, not to assert dominance, but as a personal tool connected to identity and habit. Documentation from the period also described the ways in which samurai used these blades in artistic practices. Some used them to sharpen bamboo pens or shape the nibs of writing brushes. Others used them in crafting small wooden charms or cutting paper for poetry scrolls. The blades were not limited to martial contexts. They supported intellectual and artistic pursuits. This blending of martial and artistic purposes reflected the ideal of the well-rounded warrior, someone who cultivated both physical readiness and cultural refinement. The silk wrapping served as a gentle buffer between the blade and the materials it touched, preventing accidental nicks when the blade was tucked away after creative work. Collectors and historians eventually came to appreciate the delicate interplay between the silk and the steel. They noted that silk, though soft, is remarkably durable and was valued by samurai, not only because it looked elegant, but because it protected the blade while allowing the warrior to handle it silently. Silence mattered in Edo society. Rooms with tatami floors absorbed sound, and people moved with measured steps. The samurai learned to exist within spaces where loud noises were discouraged, where the clatter of metal against metal might disrupt the composed atmosphere. The silk ensured that the blade could be carried without announcing its presence, fitting seamlessly into a culture that prized subtlety. As interest in traditional Japanese crafts and cultural practices grew outside Japan, artists and historians abroad came to view the small blade as a symbol of the country's deep appreciation for harmony between form and function. Workshops offering lessons in traditional wrapping techniques began to appear, where participants learned how to fold and tie silk in ways that resembled the old methods. Though these modern recreations often lack the deeper familial and historical connections that once defined the practice, they allowed people to appreciate the beauty of the technique and the philosophy behind it. In these workshops, instructors often described how the act of wrapping the blade helped samurai center themselves. They encouraged participants to imagine the slow, steady breathing of a warrior preparing for a day of service in a lord's domain. They asked them to picture the early morning mist outside castle gates, the sound of distant crows, and the feeling of the silk sliding between their fingertips. These exercises revealed that the small blade had always represented more than its steel. It represented a moment of stillness at the beginning of the day, a gesture of intention. On the other hand, in some parts of the world where samurai culture was romanticized or misunderstood, people imagined the small blade as a secret assassin's tool or a hidden weapon for surprise attacks. But deeper study revealed that this interpretation was largely a product of fiction. In truth, the small blade served as an instrument of daily life and a reminder of values. It was less about stealth and more about personal honor. Its silk wrapping signaled dignity, not deception. The samurai tradition emphasized that tools were to be handled respectfully, that weapons were not to be used for purposes unworthy of one's character, and that even small blades should be maintained with the same care as larger swords used in ceremonial roles. The more one studies samurai history, the clearer it becomes that the essence of their practice lay in discipline of the mind. The small blade, wrapped in silk, sat at the intersection of softness and strength. It taught that even objects capable of harm must be approached with thoughtfulness. It demonstrated that the appearance of peace does not negate the need for inner readiness. It showed that readiness without arrogance formed the heart of the samurai ideal. This philosophy persisted in modern Japanese art and literature. Writers exploring themes of memory, duty, and personal identity sometimes wove the small blade into their narratives. In these stories, characters might discover the blade in times of emotional struggle, using the silence of the object as a reminder to slow down and reflect. Painters who explored themes of heritage often included silk-wrapped blades in corner spaces of their compositions, using the contrast between soft fabric and sharp metal to evoke the dualities of existence. The blade became a symbol of the quiet tension between tradition and change. In the years following major national shifts, such as post-war reconstruction, many individuals sought objects that connected them to deeper roots. For some, the small blade symbolized continuity. Even as buildings were rebuilt, technologies advanced, and lifestyles changed, the values embedded in the samurai tradition remained accessible through these humble objects. The blade was a reminder that one could move forward without severing ties to the past. As museums and historical societies continued to curate and study these blades, they began to document regional variations in silk wrapping styles. In northern Japan, the wrappings tended to be thicker, possibly a response to colder climates that required sturdier materials. In southern regions, silk was often lighter and finer, reflecting the warmer weather and different aesthetic preferences. Some domains favored tightly bound wrappings, while others preferred slightly looser folds that gave the blade a more organic appearance. These variations provided clues to the subtle cultural differences that existed across Japan during the Edo period. In addition to stylistic differences, historians found unique personal touches in some blades. A warrior might wrap his blade with silk from a kimono that once belonged to a family member, infusing the object with emotional significance. Others embroidered small symbols or phrases into the silk, visible only to the owner. These personal touches illustrated that even within the rigid social structures of the time, samurai found ways to express individuality. The small blade became a canvas for quiet self-expression, a place where personal emotion met inherited duty. As Japan's interest in preserving intangible cultural heritage grew, more attention was given to the rituals associated with objects like the silk-wrapped blade. Documentaries were produced showing elderly artisans crafting replicas in the traditional way. Interviews captured the voices of descendants of samurai families who described the meanings passed down to them. These accounts painted a picture of continuity that stretched across centuries, revealing how cultural memory survived through objects handled with care. Even now, in the present era, a small blade wrapped in silk can evoke a profound sense of calm when held. Those who study Japanese history often describe an almost meditative experience when examining such artifacts. The smoothness of the silk, the coolness of the blade, and the gentle impression that hundreds of years lie condensed within a single object create a connection between past and present unlike anything words can express. Through this tactile experience, one understands more fully why samurai carried these blades, not to threaten or dominate, but to anchor themselves to a code of life. And so, the story continues to unfold across time. The small blade wrapped in silk remains a symbol of peaceful readiness. It embodies the idea that true strength is quiet, that the deepest power often lies in self-control, and that peace is sustained by individuals who carry discipline within them. In this way, the blade continues to speak, not in the language of violence, but in the soft voice of tradition and memory. The presence of the small silk-wrapped blade also found its way into the modern imagination through the quiet persistence of family customs. Some households, especially those with ancestral ties to particular domains, continued small rituals that echoed the habits of the samurai age. On certain days of remembrance, especially around the time when families cleaned their ancestral graves or paid respects during seasonal festivals, the blade would be taken out of its resting place and placed on a simple cloth. An elder, usually the one who had inherited responsibility for family traditions, would gently unwind a portion of the silk, not fully exposing the blade but revealing enough to acknowledge its presence. This partial unveiling symbolized memory without disturbing the peace of the present day. After a moment of reflection, the silk would be wrapped again, maintaining the sense that the blade was more spirit than steel. Such ceremonies were rarely written about or discussed outside the family. They existed quietly, passed through gestures rather than instructions, forming a living lineage of respect that reached back through the centuries. In these spaces, the blade was not an artifact or a collector's item, but a companion to memory, holding within it the stories of ancestors whose names might be forgotten, but whose values endured. Children watching these rituals often sensed the importance of the object long before they understood its historical significance. They observed the respectful silence, the slow movements, and the deliberate handling of the silk, absorbing through experience the notion that heritage expressed itself not through grand declarations, but through calm, consistent acts. Meanwhile, historians continued to unravel the deeper reasons behind the samurai's relationship to the small blade. Beyond its roles in duty, personal tasks, and symbolism, the blade also embodied a worldview rooted in mindfulness. The samurai's life was shaped by structure, from the way they dressed to how they spoke, bowed, walked, and waited. The small blade, modest in size but rich in meaning, functioned as a reminder that every aspect of life deserved attention. Its wrapping required no force, only intention. Its presence encouraged composure. Its maintenance demanded humility, for even a minor tool required care. There is a quiet clarity and understanding that many of the most meaningful objects in history were not the grand weapons or ornate treasures often displayed in museums, but simple tools that guided daily habits. The samurai lived in a time when peace itself was a form of discipline. After centuries of warfare that had shaped Japan's medieval era, the long peace of the Edo period created a society where control of one's emotions and actions became as essential as martial skill. The small blade fit into this world as a bridge between the warrior past and the administrative, scholarly, and ceremonial duties that came to define samurai life. The silk served an especially symbolic role. Silk, unlike rougher materials, carried connotations of refinement, learning, and cultural cultivation. It was associated with the clothing worn for poetry gatherings, tea ceremonies, and formal audiences. When wrapped around a blade, it softened the object's martial energy, making it feel as though it belonged to a different rhythm of life. Warriors who wrapped their blades each morning before leaving their homes internalized a sense of transition, from the private sphere of family to the public sphere of duty. The silk became a boundary line between intention and action, reminding the samurai that strength must remain balanced with restraint. In some cases, the choice of silk color held personal meaning. Families who had served particular lords might use silk in colors associated with the domain's crest. Others used patterns passed down through generations, small geometric motifs, subtle floral designs, or abstract weavings that carried echoes of older tastes. These patterns were never meant to draw attention. The blade remained an intimate possession. Its beauty was meant to be appreciated quietly, often only by its owner. This intimacy emphasized the idea that the blade was not a display piece, but a companion in one's inner life. As Japan continued into the 20th century, and as society modernized rapidly, many traditional crafts faced the risk of being forgotten. Yet the art of silk wrapping endured in small circles. Some practitioners shifted their focus to wrapping tools for calligraphy or tea ceremony implements, applying old techniques to new contexts. Others became preservationists, studying old manuals on samurai etiquette and craftsmanship, recording the patterns and methods used by artisans centuries earlier. Their work revealed that even within a single domain, variations existed based on clan customs, personal taste, and regional availability of materials. These detailed studies shed light on an aspect often overlooked in broader histories: the emotional relationship samurai had with their tools. A swordsmith might forge a magnificent blade, but it was the warrior who gave it meaning through daily care. The small blade, though far simpler than a katana, was handled with the same reverence. Warriors often spoke of tools as extensions of the self. Treating them with respect was a form of self-discipline. Neglecting them reflected poorly on one's character. The silk, kept clean and smooth, showed that the owner approached life with thoughtfulness. In letters from the Edo period, scholars found passing references to the blade in unexpected contexts. One retired samurai wrote about sharpening his small blade in the quiet hours before dawn, describing how the sound of the whetstone calmed his thoughts and prepared him for meditation. Another samurai, living far from his childhood home, mentioned wrapping his blade with silk his mother had woven for him, using the object as a way to feel connected to family during lonely seasons. These small details humanize the past, revealing that beneath the formal armor and rigid hierarchy were individuals who experienced the same longing, reflection, and need for grounding that people experience today. In villages and towns across Japan, the memory of the samurai period seeped into local folklore. Elderly storytellers sighed fondly when mentioning ancestors who carried silk-wrapped blades, describing them not as warriors of fearsome reputation, but as figures of calm and dignity. Children grew up listening to tales in which the samurai's small blade represented wisdom or humility rather than violence. These stories softened the image of the warrior, emphasizing harmony and character rather than conflict. Through these oral traditions, the symbolism of the blade was continually reshaped, becoming part of a cultural understanding that valued balance between heritage and peace. Occasionally, during periods of social transition, the presence of such blades sparked debate. Some people wondered whether preserving them encouraged romanticization of the past, while others argued that they served as reminders of cultural values worth maintaining. Yet across these discussions, one theme remained steady. The silk-wrapped blade was no longer a weapon. It had transcended its original form and grown into a vessel of memory, carrying stories that urged reflection rather than action. Collectors in the modern era often commented on the surprising emotional pull these blades carried. Even those without ancestral ties to the samurai found themselves pausing when they held one, struck by the quiet dignity embedded in the object. A collector might describe running their finger lightly across the edge of the silk, sensing the care with which it had been wrapped generations ago. They might note how the blade remained simple, lacking ornaments, emphasizing function over display. And they often remarked on the weight, not heavy, but enough to remind one that it was real, that it had lived through time. These impressions revealed something universal. Humans respond to objects infused with intention. The small blade, wrapped carefully and carried thoughtfully, told a story through its stillness. It embodied a time when people measured their days through rituals, even in peaceful eras. It spoke of a culture that believed peace required constant nurturing, not complacency. It whispered of a worldview in which humility and readiness coexisted, forming a harmony that shaped centuries of Japanese life. Arts and literature continued to expand on this symbolism. Films and novels occasionally included the silk-wrapped blade as a quiet element in scenes of introspection. A character might discover the blade while cleaning a home, triggering memories that unfolded slowly, guiding the narrative into deeper emotional layers. In such stories, the blade served as a pivot point around which themes of identity, ancestry, and personal growth revolved. Contemporary poets wrote verses in which the blade represented a threshold between the inner self and the external world, its silk wrapping functioning as a metaphor for boundaries, protection, or transformation. Museums across Japan and abroad curated exhibits dedicated not only to armor and swords, but to the daily tools of the samurai. These exhibits included writing brushes, ink stones, small woodworking implements, ceremonial objects, and of course, silk-wrapped blades. Visitors often lingered longest over the simplest items, perhaps sensing that these offered a more intimate window into the lives of people who are too often remembered solely for their role in combat. Through such exhibitions, the small blade found its place in the broader tapestry of cultural history. In university classrooms, students studying East Asian history sometimes engaged in hands-on demonstrations where replicas of small blades were wrapped in silk using traditional methods. The practice revealed the care and precision required. One misaligned fold could cause the silk to unravel. A hand that moved too quickly could disrupt the rhythm of the wrapping. The exercise taught students that craftsmanship and discipline extended far beyond large-scale techniques. They permeated even the smallest tasks of daily life. Through this embodied learning, they connected more deeply to the experiences of samurai living centuries earlier. And while the world around these traditions continued to change, the essence of the silk-wrapped blade remained relevant. In an age of speed, efficiency, and digital immediacy, the idea of taking a few moments each day to handle an object with calm intention holds renewed meaning. Some people, inspired by samurai customs, adopted small modern rituals of their own. They might wrap a cherished pen in cloth before beginning their writing, or carefully arrange their tools before work or study. They might embrace the practice not to recreate the past, but to cultivate presence in their own lives. Through all these layers of interpretation, preservation, and adaptation, the core symbolism stayed consistent. The blade represented the quiet strength that emerges when discipline meets peace. It reminded people that readiness does not require aggression, and that vigilance can exist without fear. It encouraged reflection on the balance between action and restraint, between heritage and daily living. By carrying a small blade wrapped in silk during peaceful times, samurai affirmed a belief that peace is not a passive state, but an active practice. They understood that inner steadiness supports outer harmony. The blade was a steady companion, grounding them in the responsibilities they bore to their lords, their families, and themselves. And even now, the silk-wrapped blade invites those who encounter it to slow down, breathe deeply, and consider the path that led such an object from the hands of ancient warriors to the present day. It reminds us that history is carried not just in grand events but in quiet habits, in the feel of silk between fingers, in the small decisions that shape the rhythm of daily life. As the story of the silk-wrapped blade enters the modern age, one begins to see how objects endure not because they are preserved in perfect condition, but because they continue to carry meaning that adapts to each generation. The blade itself remains unchanged, a small piece of steel wrapped in layers of silk, but the understanding of it evolves as society changes. This gradual transformation is one of the quiet miracles of cultural memory, moving forward like a gentle stream that never loses its source. In small towns where traditions linger more visibly than in the bustling heart of cities, one occasionally finds elders who keep stories of the samurai era alive through conversation, rather than formal teaching. These elders often describe how their grandparents spoke of warriors who walked with poise, who maintained discipline even in the calm of peaceful times, and who treated their tools as reflections of their own character. The small silk-wrapped blade often appeared in these stories as a symbol of inner readiness. It did not demand attention. It did not inspire fear. It simply remained nearby, a companion to mindfulness. Some elders recalled that their families once kept such a blade in an alcove known as a tokonoma, placed beside a scroll or a flower arrangement. This was not because the blade was meant to be displayed proudly, like a grand sword or an ornate piece of armor. Rather, it was positioned humbly, reminding anyone who passed that strength could be quiet. The presence of the blade in such a refined space suggested that the object belonged not only to the world of martial arts, but to a broader appreciation of balance and harmony. The silk wrapping allowed the blade to sit comfortably in this setting, softening its appearance without diminishing its significance. As the 20th century progressed, Japan underwent periods of reconstruction and growth that demanded new forms of discipline and unity. During these times, the silk-wrapped blade became a metaphor in literature and personal reflection. Writers exploring themes of loss, renewal, and identity often drew parallels between the old samurai tool and the new challenges facing society. The blade represented continuity, a reminder that even in times of rapid transformation, individuals could find strength through quiet acts of care and intention. In personal diaries that historians later uncovered, ordinary citizens wrote about inheriting small family artifacts, including silk-wrapped blades. These diaries revealed that many people who lived far removed from samurai lineages still felt a deep fascination with such objects. Some wrote about the calmness they felt while examining the blade, wondering who had wrapped it generations earlier. Others used the blade as a starting point for exploring their family's history, leading them on journeys to distant regions where their ancestors once lived. Through these explorations, the blade functioned as a thread linking people to their own past, inspiring reflection on how personal and national histories intertwine. In the mid-20th century, craftsmen who specialized in silk weaving noticed renewed interest in traditional patterns associated with samurai tools. Some revived old techniques for dyeing and folding silk, while others blended historical methods with contemporary aesthetics. Their work resulted in beautifully crafted wrappings that echoed the designs of earlier centuries while appealing to modern sensibilities. This revival was not driven by nostalgia alone, but by a desire to preserve the knowledge that had shaped so much of Japan's material culture. Craftsmanship, after all, is another form of storytelling, one carried not in words but in the movement of hands and the rhythm of practice. The more people learned about the silk-wrapped blade, the more they realized that its significance lay not in its use as a weapon, but in its role as a symbol of daily intention. The samurai, living in a time of peace, faced a paradox. They carried the title of warrior but had few opportunities to engage in the martial activity their ancestors knew so well. This paradox did not diminish their sense of purpose. Instead, it transformed their understanding of strength. Strength became defined not by combat but by composure, not by victory but by integrity. The small blade, handled every day with care, served as a daily reminder of the discipline required to live peacefully. In this sense, the blade became a silent teacher. It taught patience through the slow act of wrapping silk each morning. It taught awareness through the weight it added to a pocket or sleeve. It taught restraint through its simplicity, reminding its owner that even an object capable of harm could exist peacefully in disciplined hands. These lessons extended far beyond the samurai class, influencing philosophies related to martial arts, tea ceremony, and meditation practices that flourish even today. In the world of martial arts, instructors often describe the importance of maintaining one's tools with care, echoing the samurai tradition. Even students who train with wooden practice weapons learn to treat them with respect, cleaning them after use, storing them properly, and inspecting them for damage. This practice is not merely about preserving equipment. It cultivates an attitude of responsibility. The samurai understood this intimately, for they believed that tools reflected the state of the person who used them. A carelessly wrapped blade suggested a careless mind, while a neatly maintained one conveyed focus and sincerity. As martial arts spread globally, practitioners from many countries adopted elements of this discipline. Although few use real blades, the underlying philosophy remains relevant. People learn that mastery requires not only physical skill but mental steadiness, and that even small rituals performed consistently can cultivate an inner calm. Some teachers share stories of the silk-wrapped blade to illustrate these ideas, helping students connect with traditions that emphasize mindfulness over aggression. Meanwhile, researchers studying the psychological aspects of ritual discovered that small, repetitive actions could significantly influence a person's emotional state. The act of wrapping a blade in silk, with its deliberate movements and tactile sensations, would likely have provided samurai with a moment of grounding amid the demands of their duties. This grounding effect contributed to the calmness that characterized their public demeanor. Even in situations of political tension or administrative pressure, the samurai were expected to maintain composure. Their tools and rituals supported this expectation in subtle ways. In some rural communities, especially those with deep ties to ancestral traditions. Individuals continued to carry small utility knives wrapped in cloth well into the modern era. Though these contemporary tools had no direct connection to samurai practices, the habit of wrapping them persisted because it protected the blade and added an element of care to its use. Some elders believed the practice encouraged mindfulness in daily tasks, echoing the old belief that the way one handles tools reflects one's inner character. Through this continuity, the spirit of the samurai's silk-wrapped blade lived on in unexpected places. Artists exploring Japan's cultural identity in the modern age often incorporated the small blade into their work. Painters depicted the blade resting beside inkstones and brushes, capturing the harmony between martial and artistic pursuits that defined the samurai ideal. Sculptors created abstract representations of the blade and silk, using curves and folds to evoke the fluidity of tradition. Photographers captured images of aged hands holding the blade with tenderness, illustrating the emotional connection that persists across generations. These artistic explorations helped reshape the public perception of the samurai. Instead of viewing them as relics of warfare, people began to see them as figures who balanced strength with reflection, tradition with adaptability. The small blade played a crucial role in this reimagining, offering a glimpse into the samurai's inner world. Its presence suggested that every warrior carried not only a readiness for conflict, but a commitment to peace. The blade also found its way into educational settings. Teachers used replicas to spark discussions about Edo period culture, prompting students to reflect on how objects shape behavior. They explored questions such as why a warrior in peacetime would continue to carry a blade, and what this revealed about ideals of duty and personal conduct. Through these conversations, students learned that history is not only about battles and political shifts, but about the small choices people make each day, guided by values passed down through generations. Some schools introduced lessons on traditional crafts, teaching students how to wrap objects in cloth using techniques inspired by those once applied to the samurai's blade. These activities encouraged focus, coordination, and patience. They also provided a tangible link to cultural heritage, allowing young people to experience firsthand the quiet satisfaction that comes from working carefully with one's hands. In these classrooms, the spirit of the silk-wrapped blade lived on not as a weapon, but as a tool for learning and growth. In the world of historical preservation, museums and archives continued to gather examples of silk-wrapped blades. Curators documented variations in wrapping styles, blade shapes, and materials. They noted the ways in which wear patterns on the silk revealed how a blade had been held, carried, or stored. These details allowed researchers to reconstruct aspects of daily life that might otherwise have been lost. Through such meticulous study, the past became more vivid, revealing the tactile reality of an era often viewed from a distance. Collectors contributed to this preservation by sharing their knowledge and collaborating with experts. Some opened private collections to the public, allowing visitors to see the blades up close and to appreciate the delicate artistry of their wrappings. These exhibitions emphasize the idea that history is best understood through direct engagement. Seeing the silk fibers, the subtle curves of the blade, and the craftsmanship of the wrapping offered visitors a deeper appreciation for the values that shaped them. As interest in samurai culture expanded globally, misunderstandings occasionally arose. Some people imagined the small blade as a hidden weapon meant for sudden attacks, but trained historians and practitioners clarified that its purpose in peaceful times was far more practical and symbolic. They explained that the silk-wrapped blade reflected a worldview built on self-control, mindfulness, and the belief that personal conduct upheld social harmony. When these explanations reached broader audiences, they helped dismantle stereotypes and promote a more nuanced understanding of the samurai tradition. Gradually, the small silk-wrapped blade became recognized not only as a historical artifact, but as a universal symbol of quiet strength. It spoke to people across cultures and eras, reminding them that peace is not merely the absence of conflict, but the presence of mindful intention. It encouraged reflection on how one carries oneself in daily life, how one maintains balance between outer responsibilities and inner calm. And so, the blade continued its journey through time, touching the lives of those who encountered it with its simple yet profound presence. Whether held in a museum, passed down through a family, depicted in art, or discussed in classrooms, it carried the essence of a tradition that valued harmony above all else. The silk that wrapped it served not only to protect the blade, but to soften its image, reminding viewers that strength need not be harsh to be real. Through all these threads, history, craft, ritual, memory, the blade stands as a testament to the idea that small objects can shape great narratives. It invites anyone who reflects upon it to slow down, breathe deeply, and consider how intention shapes action. It suggests that the tools we carry, both literal and metaphorical, can guide us toward a life of balance. The story of the silk-wrapped blade gains deeper resonance when one considers how quietly it survived through so many generations. Most objects from centuries past endure only because they were preserved in controlled environments, protected from humidity or changes in temperature, or because they were stored as valuable art. Yet the small blade was rarely treated as a treasure. More often, it simply lived with families, tucked into chests, wrapped in fabric bundles, or carried from home to home as people moved. It belonged to everyday life, not exhibition halls, and this very ordinariness helped it survive. Objects tied to daily ritual often outlast grand artifacts, for they are handled with care not because they are precious, but because they are familiar. In this sense, the silk-wrapped blade mirrors the endurance of cultural values themselves. Traditions continue not because they are loudly proclaimed, but because they are quietly practiced. One does not need a ceremony to wrap a blade with silk. One only needs a few moments of intention. The act lives not in public display, but in private rhythm, repeated day after day until it becomes part of who a person is. This is how the samurai preserved their identity in peaceful times, and how the symbolic spirit of their practices carried into the modern world. As scholars piece together more detailed accounts of samurai life, they realized that the small blade played a role in teaching young warriors the importance of humility. Even boys born into high-ranking families learned to maintain their own tools as part of their early education. They were not permitted to handle full swords until they had proven responsible enough to care for smaller implements. Before a boy could wield the elegant but intimidating katana, he first learned how to wrap and maintain the smaller blade. This ensured that his relationship with tools began with thoughtfulness rather than pride. The silk taught him patience. The blade taught him caution. Together, they formed a foundational lesson in self-restraint. Older samurai often passed down advice that emphasized this progression. They cautioned that a warrior who could not care for a small blade was not ready to care for a larger one. They explained that recklessness often began with neglect of small responsibilities. In this way, the silk-wrapped blade functioned as a quiet instructor, shaping character long before military skill was required. Through discipline in peaceful times, the samurai prepared themselves for challenges they hoped would never come. Their goal was not to seek conflict, but to be ready if it arrived. The peaceful nature of the Edo period meant that most samurai lived their entire lives without ever seeing battlefield combat. This reality shaped the meaning of their tools in profound ways. When conflict is a daily threat, weapons become instruments of survival. But when peace stretches across generations, the same weapons transform into symbols of duty, identity, and mindfulness. The small blade in particular represented this transformation clearly. It was not used to attack, nor to intimidate, nor to display power. It was a companion during quiet moments, a tool for writing, crafting, preparing, and reflecting. The silk ensured that the blade did not appear aggressive. Its wrapping muffled the steel and softened the object's presence. It also protected the blade from rust caused by humidity in Japan's varied climate. Practical considerations merged with aesthetic values, creating a union of function and beauty that characterized much of Japanese craftsmanship. Over time, artisans who specialized in silk wrapping elevated the practice into a subtle art form. They experimented with different patterns, textures, and folding methods, refining techniques that had been passed down through families for centuries. These artisans often worked in small studios, surrounded by spools of dyed silk in colors inspired by nature. The deep green of pine needles, the muted brown of autumn fields, the pale blue of early morning mist, the soft pink of cherry blossoms, the warm beige of sand along riverbanks. Each color carried associations that extended beyond aesthetics into the emotional landscape of those who used the silk. Samurai choosing a particular wrapping sometimes did so not for symbolic meaning, but simply because the color resonated with them. Yet even such personal choices became part of the blade's story, revealing the human touch that shaped every aspect of its existence. In some families, the silk used to wrap the blade came from old garments, perhaps a kimono worn by a parent or grandparent, perhaps cloth saved from a wedding or other significant event. Using silk from clothing imbued the blade with emotional layers beyond its practical purpose. A samurai might wrap his small blade with silk that once belonged to his mother, carrying with him a tangible reminder of her presence. This practice connected the duties of the warrior with the bonds of family, grounding the samurai's identity not only in social rank but in personal relationships. When such blades were passed down through generations, the silk became as meaningful as the blade itself, even as it frayed or faded. Descendants often left the silk untouched, honoring the hands that wrapped it long before. The wrapping became a form of handwriting, a message from the past expressed through layers of cloth. Each fold represented a moment of someone's life, preserved across time, offering descendants a quiet link to their ancestors. As the modern era progressed, many families lost the stories associated with their silk-wrapped blades. Yet even when the original narratives faded, the objects still communicated a sense of calm dignity. People found themselves drawn to the softness of the silk and the simplicity of the blade. They felt the weight of history without needing to know every detail. This subtle communication is one of the most powerful aspects of material culture. Objects do not need explanation to convey meaning. They carry their own presence, inviting reflection from anyone who encounters them. In museums, curators often note how visitors linger near smaller objects longer than they expect. Grand suits of armor and full swords draw initial attention, but the intimate artifacts, the writing brushes, tea utensils, personal charms, and small blades, hold visitors in a quieter, deeper way. These objects reveal the texture of daily life. They remind people that the past was not composed only of dramatic events, but of countless small moments shaped by routine and ritual. The silk-wrapped blade, when placed among other personal items, encourages viewers to imagine the hands that wrapped it, the pocket that held it, the stories it witnessed. As the popularity of tea ceremony experienced renewed interest, the symbolic connection between the ceremony's values and the samurai's silk-wrapped blade became more apparent. The tea ceremony emphasizes calm presence, deliberate movement, and appreciation of simple beauty. Many samurai studied tea ceremony as part of their education, believing that its disciplined grace refined their character. The principles of the ceremony, humility, attention to detail, harmony with surroundings, mirrored the principles that guided the use and maintenance of the blade. Both practices encouraged individuals to cultivate inner quiet and clear perception. Instructors of tea ceremony sometimes spoke of tools as having their own spirit, shaped not by supernatural forces but by the care given to them. A well-maintained tea scoop, handled gently for decades, seemed to carry the warmth of the hands that used it. The silk-wrapped blade shared this quality. Its silk retained the impression of fingers that held it, folded it, or smoothed it into place. Even worn silk carried a palpable sense of presence, as if the fabric remembered the rhythms of long-gone mornings. Modern artisans who specialized in blade restoration noted that many silk-wrapped blades showed wear in specific places that corresponded to habitual use. Creases in the silk aligned with the shape of the owner's hand. Slight discolorations revealed where fingers had pressed most often. These traces provided glimpses into the lives of the people who once carried the blade. One could imagine a samurai tightening the wrapping on a winter morning, warming the cold steel with his hands, or adjusting the silk after a long ride between castle towns. Each mark offered an unspoken story. Contemporary scholars examining these details found themselves reflecting not only on history, but on the nature of human connection. They observed that people across cultures and eras assign meaning to simple objects, investing them with layers of personal memory. A child might keep a pebble from a favorite place. A grandparent might preserve a letter written decades earlier. These objects become anchors, grounding individuals in their sense of identity. The small blade served this purpose for samurai and their descendants, linking personal experiences to broader cultural values. The blade's presence in modern Japanese homes became a symbol of continuity, not in a rigid sense, but in a quiet, living way. Some families placed the blade in a special wooden box. Others displayed it subtly, not as a showpiece, but as a gentle reminder of their heritage. In many cases, the blade was not brought out often. It remained tucked away, resting in darkness, waiting to be held in moments of reflection or remembrance. This subtlety aligned with the Japanese aesthetic of restrained beauty, where meaning is found in what is not immediately visible. As time progressed, more people became interested in exploring their ancestry. Genealogical studies, once limited to specialists, expanded into a widespread hobby. Individuals whose families had preserved silk-wrapped blades often used the objects as starting points for their research. The blade might bear a family crest, a maker's mark, or subtle stylistic features that pointed to a particular region. Historians and craftspeople helped identify these clues, allowing families to trace their origins back centuries. Through such discoveries, the blade became not only a symbol of samurai values, but a guide to the past. In some cases, descendants who had long believed their families were ordinary farmers discovered through these objects that they had ties to lower-ranking samurai who lived as administrators, teachers, or village protectors during the Edo period. These revelations encouraged people to rethink their understanding of the past, realizing that the boundary between samurai and commoner was more fluid than many imagined. The blade functioned as a bridge between personal identity and social history, helping people appreciate the complexity of their heritage. The study of these blades also drew interest from philosophers and cultural historians who saw them as embodiments of broader ideas. They argued that the blade's dual nature, sharp steel wrapped in soft silk, symbolized the balance between strength and gentleness. They noted that this balance was central to many aspects of Japanese culture, from martial arts to poetry, from architecture to garden design. The blade thus became a metaphor, representing the coexistence of contrasting qualities. It reminded people that harmony arises not from uniformity, but from the interplay of differing elements. Today, the small silk-wrapped blade still appears in unexpected places. It might be featured in an art installation exploring themes of memory and identity. It might be used in a historical drama as a symbol of a character's introspection. It might rest quietly in a drawer of a family home, wrapped in silk that has softened with time. Wherever it appears, it invites a moment of stillness. It offers a glimpse into a world where deliberate action shaped daily life, where discipline fostered peace, and where even the smallest tool carried profound meaning. Through all the centuries that separate the samurai era from the present day, the silk-wrapped blade continues to whisper a simple message: that true strength does not require display, that readiness can exist without aggression, and that peace is sustained through mindful awareness. It encourages anyone who reflects upon it to carry their responsibilities with quiet dignity, to appreciate the beauty of small rituals, and to maintain balance between inner intention and outward action. As the story of the silk-wrapped blade drifted further into modern awareness, new interpretations emerged, shaped by historians, craftsmen, practitioners of traditional arts, and ordinary people who felt something stir within them when they encountered these quiet objects. Each interpretation added another layer to the blade's evolving meaning, not replacing history, but deepening the understanding of how history lives inside objects long after the people who used them are gone. The blade, once a tool of samurai discipline, began to reveal itself as a vessel for the subtle movements of culture that ripple through centuries in ways few artifacts manage to do. One of the lesser-known aspects of samurai daily life that began to attract scholarly attention was the use of the small blade in poetic practice. Many samurai composed poems, not merely as an artistic pursuit, but as part of their training in observing the world with clarity. Some of them carried small slips of paper folded inside the same cloth pouch that held the blade. These slips were blank most of the time, waiting for a moment when inspiration might strike. When a samurai paused beside a stream or stood beneath a moonlit veranda or waited during a quiet moment in his administrative duties, he sometimes used the blade to sharpen a writing tool or to cut paper into narrow strips for poems. The soft rustle of silk as the blade was unwrapped was often said to encourage stillness, as if the unfolding of the cloth resembled the unfolding of thought. Writings from the period describe how the very act of preparing to write could influence the poem. A blade wrapped in silk required gentle movements to uncover, and these movements calmed the mind. The samurai who practiced poetry were not attempting to escape their responsibilities. They were seeking to understand them more deeply. The silk, with its smooth texture and subtle scent, often infused with natural dyes, reminded them of the delicate balance that underpinned their world. A poem written after unwrapping the blade might reflect this balance, blending the sharp observation of a warrior with the soft awareness of nature's shifting moods. Some schools of swordsmanship even encouraged their students to pair martial training with writing and painting, arguing that a warrior who understood beauty would avoid unnecessary violence. In this way, the silk-wrapped blade became symbolic not only of discipline, but of creativity. It was a reminder that a warrior's strength was measured not solely by his physical skill, but by the clarity of his perception. A person who could appreciate the fleeting beauty of a falling leaf or the play of light on water was less likely to act rashly. The blade was not merely a tool, it was a companion in cultivating mindfulness. Another aspect of the blade's history that began to attract renewed interest was its role in communication during the Edo period. While large swords served as symbols of rank, the small blade was often used to cut seals, open letters, or prepare small items needed for writing. Peaceful times meant that samurai responsibilities shifted from combat to administration, diplomacy, and civil leadership. Samurai were often required to write reports, compose official letters, and review documents. In some regions, the small blade became an essential part of bureaucratic life. Its silk wrapping ensured that it could be handled discreetly, without attracting attention or disrupting the quiet atmosphere of administrative offices. Historical accounts from castle towns describe the soft movements of samurai removing the blade from its pouch as they worked through stacks of documents. The silk-wrapped blade was rarely displayed openly. Instead, it emerged only when needed, its presence subtle and efficient. The silk absorbed sound, preventing the faint clink of metal from echoing through rooms where quiet concentration was required. In a culture that valued harmony and composure, this quietness mattered. Even the smallest noise had the power to disrupt the flow of work in rooms where dozens of officials sat side by side, writing and reviewing documents that shaped the governance of their domains. This practical role helped the blade maintain its presence in peaceful times. It remained relevant even when large swords became more ceremonial. Young samurai learned that their effectiveness as administrators depended on their ability to work with precision and calm attention. The small blade, with its silk wrapping, fit seamlessly into this environment. It embodied the idea that strength could be expressed in efficient action, not only in battle, but in the careful management of daily responsibilities. This subtle shift in purpose reflected the broader transformation of the samurai class as they adapted to centuries of peace. As the 18th and 19th centuries unfolded, new artistic movements began to influence the way samurai perceived themselves and their tools. One such movement centered on the appreciation of objects for their imperfections. Rather than seeking flawless beauty, this aesthetic valued signs of age, wear, and repair. The silk-wrapped blade, with its fraying edges and faded colors, became a profound expression of this philosophy. Each wrinkle in the fabric, each faint stain, each softened fold told a story of use, of time, of the hands that had held it. Writers of the era occasionally referenced silk-wrapped blades in essays exploring the beauty of the ephemeral. They compared the worn silk to autumn leaves or weathered wood, noting how the passage of time could heighten, rather than diminish, the object's beauty. The blade's smallness became a virtue, allowing viewers to appreciate its details intimately. One essay described how a man found himself contemplating the silk pattern on his family's blade one rainy afternoon, marveling at how many generations had preserved this small piece of cloth. In that moment, he felt time stretch and contract, connecting his present life with those who had lived centuries before. Artifacts that evoke such moments remind us that history is not composed only of grand events, but of countless quiet moments that shape perception and meaning. The silk-wrapped blade became a teacher in this sense, showing how small objects can anchor memory and identity. It demonstrated that the past does not always announce itself loudly. Often, it whispers through subtle textures and forms, inviting reflection rather than demanding attention. In some rural regions, the tradition of wrapping small blades with silk continued well into the modern era, even among families who no longer identified strongly with their samurai heritage. For them, the practice became less about martial history and more about preserving a family ritual. A parent might show their child how to wrap the blade properly, explaining that this was something their own parent had taught them. The blade might be brought out only during seasonal festivals or on certain anniversaries. These small moments reinforced continuity across generations. One particularly touching account tells of a family whose ancestors had served as low-ranking castle guards. They preserved a small blade wrapped in lavender-colored silk that had been repaired dozens of times. The original cloth was long gone, replaced piece by descendants who felt a responsibility to keep the tradition alive. Every few decades, when the silk frayed too much, a family member would sew a new section, carefully matching the color as closely as possible. Over time, the blade accumulated layers of silk from different eras, creating a tangible history of the family's resilience. They no longer remembered the blade's original purpose, yet they understood its importance. The act of wrapping it connected them to their ancestors, reminding them of the values that had shaped their family across time. As more people began to study how traditional objects survive into modern times, the silk-wrapped blade emerged as a case study in cultural resilience. Scholars observed that objects tied to everyday rituals tend to endure more naturally than grand ceremonial items. This is because everyday objects integrate into the rhythms of life. They become habitual companions, handled often, cared for instinctively, and passed down without fanfare. The silk-wrapped blade exemplified this pattern. It survived not because it was considered a treasure, but because it was quietly woven into the fabric of daily existence. This insight led researchers to reconsider how they approached the study of samurai culture. Rather than focusing solely on armor, battles, and major political shifts, they began to explore the small routines that defined daily life. The more they studied these routines, the more they realized that the essence of the samurai spirit resided not only in dramatic acts of bravery, but in disciplined attention to everyday tasks. The silk-wrapped blade became a symbol of this subtle form of strength. It represented the philosophy that character is shaped in moments of calm, not only in moments of crisis. During the late 20th century, as interest in mindfulness spread around the world, many people discovered parallels between modern practices and the ancient traditions embodied in the silk-wrapped blade. The deliberate movements required to wrap and maintain the blade aligned closely with mindfulness principles. Handling the blade encouraged focus, presence, and intentionality. Even people without samurai heritage found value in this quiet ritual. Some practitioners of modern martial arts adopted the practice as a way to ground themselves before training. They found that the process calmed their minds and reminded them that martial skill should be rooted in peace, not aggression. Craftsmen who specialized in traditional techniques began to teach workshops on silk wrapping. Participants learned how to fold the cloth in a way that protected the blade while preserving its simplicity. Many described the process as meditative. They found themselves slowing down, paying attention to the texture of the silk, the angle of each fold, the tension created by pulling the cloth snugly around the blade. These workshops helped revive an appreciation for the artistry behind everyday objects. People began to understand that the blade's beauty lay not only in the steel, but in the care that shaped its presentation. At the same time, collectors and historians noticed a growing interest in small, personal artifacts from the samurai era. While full swords remained highly valued, the small silk-wrapped blades began to capture attention for their intimacy. They offered a glimpse into the private life of a samurai, revealing aspects of identity that public displays of martial power could not. These blades were not made for spectacle. They were made for quiet moments of work, reflection, and ritual. This intimacy resonated with people seeking a deeper connection to the past. As this appreciation grew, museums curated exhibits that highlighted the quieter side of samurai life. Instead of focusing solely on armor and battle scenes, they explored the routines of peace, writing, tea drinking, gardening, calligraphy, and the care of personal tools like the silk-wrapped blade. Visitors often found these exhibits unexpectedly moving. The small objects humanized the samurai, revealing them not as distant warriors but as individuals who lived complex, nuanced lives filled with moments of contemplation and creative expression. One museum crafted an installation where visitors walked through a dimly lit room lined with silk-wrapped blades displayed on simple wooden stands. Soft lighting illuminated each one, highlighting the variations in silk texture and color. The room was quiet, encouraging visitors to move slowly, mirroring the calm presence that the blades themselves represented. Many who entered this room described feeling a sense of peaceful introspection. The blades seemed to whisper stories, not loudly but gently, inviting viewers to imagine the lives they had once accompanied. In the present day, some artisans have begun creating modern interpretations of the silk-wrapped blade. These versions are not weapons but small tools used for writing, crafting, or meditation. They draw inspiration from the original practice while adapting to contemporary needs. People use them to prepare writing materials, cut paper for journals, or as part of personal rituals that help center the mind before creative work. The silk-wrapped tool has thus become a symbol of intentional practice, bridging ancient tradition and modern mindfulness. The enduring presence of the silk-wrapped blade reveals something profound about human nature, that people seek objects that help anchor them in their sense of self. In times of uncertainty, individuals often turn to small rituals to ground themselves. The samurai, living through periods of both war and peace, understood this deeply. Their small blade, wrapped in silk, served as a stabilizing companion, reminding them of their responsibilities, their values, and their connection to the world around them. As the silk-wrapped blade continued to travel quietly through the centuries, its meaning grew richer, shaped by changing times and the evolving ways people understood their past. In recent decades, a new thread of research emerged that brought renewed attention to how these small blades function not only as tools and symbols, but as anchors in moments when the world shifted dramatically. This perspective highlighted how calm traditions often serve as lifelines during transitions, allowing people to carry familiar values into unfamiliar futures. The silk-wrapped blade, humble in size yet profound in meaning, became a vivid example of how continuity survives through quiet, personal rituals. When Japan entered the period of modernization in the late 19th century, countless aspects of samurai identity faced abrupt transformation. Many former warriors struggled with the loss of their role in society, their stipends removed, their legal privileges ended, and their weapons regulated. Large swords were often surrendered, sold, or stored away, but the small blades wrapped in silk remained in family homes, largely unnoticed by officials because they were considered personal tools rather than weapons of war. This allowed them to move quietly into the new era, preserving a fragment of samurai life even as the world around them changed. Families who had once relied on their status now found themselves reinventing their livelihoods. Some opened shops, others became teachers, others moved into government administration, and many simply blended into the growing urban workforce. During this time of uncertainty, the small blade remained a subtle reminder of the discipline, dignity, and mindfulness that had once defined their daily lives. A former samurai who worked as a clerk in a modern office might keep the blade in a drawer, wrapped in the same silk that his grandfather had folded around it. Even if he no longer had a formal need for it, its presence offered comfort, linking him to a legacy of composure and purposeful living. The passing of these blades from one generation to the next often carried stories, even if the stories became abbreviated or transformed over time. A child might ask about the small bundle of silk in a wooden box, and a parent might respond with a quiet explanation that it came from their ancestors and represented careful living. Even without full histories, the object's aura encouraged curiosity. Children whose families preserved these blades learned early on that heritage does not always reveal itself in loud or dramatic ways. Sometimes it lives in the softest materials, folded with care, and placed gently into the hands of those willing to listen. In contemporary Japan, the meaning of the silk-wrapped blade continues to evolve. Scholars who study material culture argue that objects like these represent an unbroken thread that weaves through centuries of daily life. Unlike monuments or official records, which often reflect the intentions of leaders, personal artifacts reflect the intentions of families and individuals. They show how people made sense of the world during quiet moments. The small blade tells a story not of battles or political reforms, but of discipline, craftsmanship, creativity, and the human need for grounding rituals. It reveals the side of the samurai that rarely appears in dramatic retellings, a side defined by attentiveness, subtlety, and inner balance. One modern craftsman who became fascinated with the history of silk wrapping traveled across Japan to study surviving examples of these blades. He visited remote households, small museums, and regional archives, gathering observations about the variations in wrapping techniques. He discovered that each region developed its own nuances. Some areas favored tighter wraps that concealed the blade almost completely, while others preferred looser arrangements that allowed glimpses of the steel beneath the silk. Some used plain fabrics, others used bright patterns inherited from family garments. In one household, he found a blade wrapped in silk that had once been part of a festival kimono. Its vibrant colors had faded with time, but faint traces of red and gold still shimmered in the folds. This craftsman noticed that the silk itself often held clues to the blade's age and origins. Certain weaving styles were unique to particular regions. Some dyes were made from local plants that had fallen out of use, giving the silk a distinctive tone found in no modern fabric. In examining these details, he realized that the blades were not only historical objects but geographical stories, carrying traces of the landscapes, climates, and communities that had shaped them. A blade wrapped in silk dyed with indigo from the countryside carried the scent of riverside fields. A blade wrapped in silk colored with persimmon tannin held the warmth of autumn harvests. Each piece of cloth encapsulated a piece of lived experience. The craftsman began sharing his findings with students who sought to revive traditional arts. He taught them that the process of wrapping a blade was not merely a technique, but a form of storytelling. Every fold represented a choice. Every piece of silk carried memory. Every blade embodied the quiet interplay of steel and softness. Through his teaching, a new generation developed an appreciation for the cultural subtleties embedded in this simple practice. These students approached the blade not as a weapon, but as a symbol of harmony between intention and action. They learned to wrap slowly, observing how the silk responded to touch. They discovered that the process required not only dexterity but patience, humility, and presence. Across oceans and continents, people outside Japan also developed an interest in the calm history of samurai life. Museums, cultural centers, and martial arts schools around the world began exploring not only the dramatic aspects of samurai heritage, but also the quieter practices that defined everyday existence. Exhibits that focused on the silk-wrapped blade allowed visitors to engage with the idea that historical understanding deepens when one attends to the small, often overlooked details. These blades inspired conversations about how different cultures handle the relationship between strength and peace, responsibility and restraint. Writers, filmmakers, and artists who encountered these blades often found themselves drawn to their poetic qualities. The contrast between the sharp steel and the soft silk created a compelling metaphor for the contradictions that exist within all people. Artists began incorporating silk-wrapped tools into installations exploring themes of memory, loss, and transformation. The small blade became a symbol of inner stillness amidst life's complexities. It reminded viewers that even in turbulent times, individuals can cultivate rituals that anchor them in calm intention. In meditation circles, the concept of the silk-wrapped blade sometimes emerged in discussions about inner discipline. Practitioners used the blade as a metaphor for the mind, sharp, precise, and capable of great clarity when cared for with gentleness. The silk became a symbol of compassion, reminding them that strength without softness leads to rigidity, while softness without structure leads to aimlessness. Together, the blade and the silk formed a balanced whole. This metaphor resonated deeply with people seeking to integrate mindfulness into their daily lives. It offered a reminder that inner harmony arises from the interplay of firmness and gentleness, discipline and kindness. Meanwhile, historians continued to uncover new insights about how samurai used their small blades during peaceful times. One discovery came from examining old diaries written by lower-level officials in castle towns. These writings described how the blade accompanied the samurai during routine inspections of storehouses, granaries, and fields. The blade was used to cut twine, adjust tools, prepare simple repairs, or mark wooden boards. Wrapped in silk, it remained clean and protected, ready for practical tasks that required precision. The diaries highlighted how work during peaceful times demanded different skills than those of war: organizational ability, attentiveness to detail, and responsibility for the well-being of entire communities. Another discovery involved the role of the blade in ceremonies of seasonal change. In some regions, samurai used the blade during New Year rituals to prepare small offerings or to carve thin wooden slips inscribed with wishes for the coming year. The silk wrapping ensured that the blade was treated with respect during these rituals, reinforcing the connection between everyday tools and spiritual intention. Some families continued this practice long after the samurai era ended, adapting it to modern traditions. The blade thus became part of the rhythm of time, marking transitions and reminding people of their shared hopes for peace and stability. In recent years, a fascinating academic discussion emerged around the relationship between the blade and the sensory world. Scholars studying sensory history, an area that explores how people experience life through sight, sound, touch, smell, and taste, observed that the silk-wrapped blade engaged multiple senses at once. Its appearance invited visual appreciation of texture and color. Its softness invited touch. Its faint scent, derived from the natural dyes used in traditional silk, connected users to memories and environments. Even the sound of the silk unfolding created a subtle experience. This multisensory quality made the blade more than an object. It became a small landscape of perception. The sensory richness of the blade influenced how samurai experienced daily life. When they handled it, they entered a state of focused awareness. The act of unwrapping or rewrapping the blade slowed their movements, encouraging them to be present. This presence was crucial in a culture that valued measured action. Samurai were taught from a young age that careless movements reflected careless thoughts. The blade's silk wrapping, therefore, served not only a protective function but a pedagogical one. It trained the body and mind to work in harmony. This understanding deepened when researchers began comparing the silk-wrapped blade with other traditional Japanese objects that encouraged similar forms of attentiveness. Tea utensils, calligraphy brushes, incense tools, and even simple wooden boxes shared qualities of quiet design and tactile invitation. These objects guided users toward mindful awareness, not through instruction, but through their inherent form. The blade, when seen alongside these objects, represented the martial side of this aesthetic, demonstrating that mindfulness pervaded all aspects of samurai life, not only artistic pursuits. As interest in the psychological benefits of tactile rituals grew, therapists and counselors began referencing the silk-wrapped blade in discussions about grounding techniques. They explained that small, intentional rituals could help individuals manage stress, anxiety, or transition. The blade served as a historical example of how people across time have used simple actions to maintain stability. By wrapping silk smoothly around steel, a samurai practiced grounding without nomming it as such. Modern individuals, discovering or recreating similar rituals, found comfort in this ancient precedent. It reminded them that seeking calm through touch and intention was not a modern invention, but a deeply human practice. Today, the silk-wrapped blade continues to inspire new interpretations. It appears in literature as a symbol of quiet resilience. It appears in museums as a testament to the intimate side of history. It appears in homes as a family heirloom or a modern recreation. In every setting, it carries the same whisper: that strength can be gentle, that discipline can be compassionate, and that peace is built through countless small acts of mindful attention. The Edo period, stretching from the early 17th century into the 19th, brought an unprecedented calm across Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate centralized authority, maintained strict social hierarchies, and enforced laws that limited the frequency of warfare. Samurai, the warrior class, found themselves navigating a landscape in which physical battles became rare, yet expectations of discipline, honor, and readiness remained constant. The small blade, carefully wrapped in silk, was one of the many tools through which samurai expressed this enduring readiness. Even in peaceful times, samurai were expected to maintain vigilance. The small blade served as a tangible reminder that while battles were infrequent, responsibility was continuous. It was not merely a weapon, but a symbol of preparedness and self-mastery. Unlike the katana, which often carried ceremonial or social significance, the small blade was intimate and personal. It rested close to the body, often hidden beneath the folds of clothing, wrapped in soft silk that muffled its presence, making it a discreet companion for daily life. The silk wrapping itself carried layered significance. Practically, it protected the steel from moisture, dust, and wear. But beyond protection, the silk represented care and mindfulness. To wrap a blade properly required calm, attention, and steady hands, a ritual that mirrored the broader discipline of the samurai. In unwrapping and rewrapping the blade, the warrior practiced presence, connecting physical action with a mental state of readiness. This simple act reinforced the idea that even in peace, one's mind, body, and tools must be maintained with intention. Historical records show that samurai used small blades in numerous practical ways. They were instruments for cutting cord, carving wood, opening letters, or preparing small tasks that required precision. Diaries from the period describe how a samurai, while inspecting storehouses or administrative records, would quietly unfold his silk-wrapped blade to perform necessary duties. The ritual of unwrapping the silk made even mundane tasks an opportunity for reflection and attentiveness. It demonstrated that the samurai's strength lay not only in combat, but in the deliberate care with which they approached all aspects of life. Moreover, the small blade held profound symbolic and familial significance. In many households, blades were passed down from generation to generation, wrapped in the same silk or replaced with silk preserved for decades. The silk often came from garments of ancestors, creating a tactile link between past and present. Through this physical continuity, the blade became a vessel of memory. Children learned that respect for one's tools and one's heritage was inseparable. To care for the blade was to honor those who had wielded it before, and in doing so, to maintain the values of calm vigilance and personal integrity. Even beyond families, samurai culture emphasized the intertwining of martial and artistic discipline. Many samurai engaged in poetry, calligraphy, tea ceremony, and gardening. These pursuits shared qualities with the act of wrapping the blade: attention to detail, patience, and a harmonious balance of action and stillness. Unwrapping the blade became a meditation in miniature. The tactile sensation of smooth silk and cool steel, combined with the deliberate, careful motion, reinforced mindfulness. Some schools of martial arts explicitly integrated such practices into training, teaching that strength without composure was hollow, and that the true mark of a warrior was the cultivation of both external skill and internal clarity. As the centuries passed, the small blade evolved in meaning. When Japan began modernizing in the late 19th century, many samurai lost their formal status, and large swords were regulated or surrendered. Yet small blades wrapped in silk quietly persisted, moving through households largely unnoticed by authorities. They survived as private reminders of a disciplined past, enduring symbols of composure and heritage. Descendants who had never wielded a sword could still touch the blade, feel the silk, and connect with a lineage of careful thought, dedication, and responsibility. In modern times, historians, collectors, and craftsmen began to rediscover the cultural and aesthetic significance of these small blades. Museums highlighted them not as weapons but as intimate objects, revealing the quiet life of samurai away from the battlefield. Artisans revived the craft of silk wrapping, teaching it as both historical preservation and meditative practice. Modern martial arts schools incorporate replicas into mindfulness exercises, allowing practitioners to experience the same grounding ritual that guided samurai centuries ago. Across cultures, the blade has become a universal symbol of calm focus, readiness, and careful attention to life's details. The significance of the silk-wrapped blade also extends into philosophical reflections. Its duality, hard steel softened by gentle silk, mirrors the balance of strength and humility that defines ethical action. The blade embodies restraint, showing that power need not be displayed to be effective, and that preparation is not aggression but prudence. It reminds us that peace is not passive. It is an active practice, cultivated through care, reflection, and discipline. The blade's continuing presence through centuries of change illustrates how small, meaningful rituals anchor human identity, even when societies transform dramatically. Moreover, the blade teaches about continuity and memory. Each fold of silk, each mark of wear, carries the trace of human hands and lives long past. Objects like this demonstrate that history is lived not only in grand events, but in daily acts of attention. They show that care, mindfulness, and responsibility can endure quietly, becoming part of the cultural fabric in ways that survive beyond records, battles, or politics. By observing such objects, We can learn the value of small, deliberate acts that shape character, reinforce identity, and cultivate calm. We also see that the small blade functions as a bridge across generations and social changes. Its presence reminds us that tools, even modest ones, carry stories. They teach values without words. They connect the living with those who have gone before. For samurai, the blade wrapped in silk linked martial tradition to domestic life, past to present, and personal discipline to community responsibility. Even in peace, it sustained a warrior's sense of purpose. Even now, it carries lessons for anyone who observes, handles, or reflects upon it. The story of the silk-wrapped blade ultimately invites a broader reflection on life itself. It asks us to consider the role of small rituals, the value of attentiveness, and the meaning of calm preparation. Just as the samurai carried a blade not to seek conflict, but to maintain readiness, we too can cultivate practices that anchor us in our values and intentions. Whether through handling an object with care, performing a deliberate task, or observing daily routines with mindfulness, we participate in the same human impulse that gave rise to the silk-wrapped blade, the desire to live with purpose, integrity, and calm presence. In summary, why did the samurai carry small blades wrapped in silk during peaceful times? The answer is multi-layered. They carried them as tools for practical use, as instruments of ritual, as symbols of mindfulness, as links to family and ancestry, and as reminders that readiness and responsibility do not end when battles cease. The silk wrapping, in turn, was not merely functional. It transformed the blade into an object of calm, care, and aesthetic consideration. It allowed the samurai to engage with their tools thoughtfully, preserving both the metal and the meaning it embodied. Over centuries, these small blades became more than weapons. They became teachers, guides, and carriers of cultural memory. They remain today as intimate connections to a philosophy that valued the subtle integration of discipline, beauty, and serenity. Thank you for watching and sharing in this exploration of history. I hope this journey through the life of the samurai and their silk-wrapped blades offered both insight and calm. If you enjoyed this narrative, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and stay tuned for more stories that bring the past to life in quiet, thoughtful ways. It has been a pleasure guiding you through this story, and I hope it inspires reflection, curiosity, and a sense of connection to the subtle rhythms of human history.